Together, we work as one for better LGBTIQ lives. Outright.
Good morning and welcome to Out Summit 2022, and this is the second of two sessions that are running concurrently now at 10:30 Eastern Time in the United States. And this session is entitled How the Anti-Gender Movement Affects Us All. We'll look basically at how the anti-gender movements have profoundly changed the landscape facing LGBTI rights and gender equality movements globally, especially in the last 10 years. Aligned to these coalitions that are broadly opposed to progressive recognition of human rights standards and social and economic progressive movements. We will be discussing just how deep this subject goes, and hopefully at the end of the conversation we will have spoken about or addressed some ways we can try and find a solution to how we can answer these problems. I'm joined by an esteemed panel of Jabo Pereira, Erica Castellanos, and Vian Ruth Snyder, who I will ask to introduce themselves. My name is Ricky Nathanson. I am the Senior Advisor of the Global Trans Program at Outright International. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm originally from Zimbabwe, but currently based in Washington, D.C. area. And I will hand it over to Björn.
Thank you, Ricky. I'm Björn Ruth Snyder. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Senior Policy Fellow at the Council for Global Equality in Washington, D.C. I work at the intersections of LGBT rights, abortion rights, the HIV movement, and the law. And I've spent a lot of time in the recent years on how the US government policies contribute to the anti-gender movement globally.
Thank you, Vian. Erica?
Thank you, Ricky. My name is Erica Castellanos. I pronounce she, her. I work with GATE. We work with transgender, diverse, and intersex communities globally. I'm from Belize and reside in the Netherlands. Thank you.
And Jabo.
Oh, so great to be here. Hi, everyone. I'm residing in Johannesburg, South Africa. I'm a trans man. I'm an activist. He, his pronouns, and I'm really looking forward to engaging for the next hour.
Right, thank you. And I look forward to a rich discussion with the three of you. Across the four of us, there is years and years of experience, passion for the movement. So we'll dive straight in, and I'll ask Björn to give us a few words.
Thank you, Ricky. So I'm going to just start with sort of a broad strokes of what is the global anti-gender movement. And it's a hard thing to start with because it's pretty amorphous and it shows up in different ways in different countries and in different moments. But generally, we would say it's a group of state and non-state actors who are really intent, as Ricky said at the outset, on imposing an alternative, very conservative set of norms and laws concerning rights. And so especially bodily and relational rights. Rights to your own body, rights to choose who you marry, rights to construct your own family, rights to construct your own medical care. All of those pieces tend to be central to how they want to define away some things from the rights movement. It's a coordinated movement, but it's not centralized. And that's really important to know. But there are some big actors that show up again and again, both in power and also in money. It is very well funded, much better funded than our movements. And it's not necessarily consistent or coherent, which can make engagement really frustrating. So the tactics that folks in England might be up against aren't necessarily the same as the way the anti-gender movement shows up at the UN or in Indonesia. But oftentimes there are real connections, both in funding and in intellectual leadership, and in their gatherings, getting together at the World Conference of Families and other spaces. The anti-gender movement, both in state acting and in non-state NGO and church actions, tends to focus on very contentious wedge issues. But they can be quite flexible and context specific on that. However, we tend to see the wedge issues to define rights in a broad way. The wedge tends to be very vulnerable groups or vulnerable sort of ongoing political conversations in a country. So it may be because of the vulnerability of trans people, we see the rights, the legal rights, the social rights of trans people as a wedge issue used around the world by governments and churches who are part of the anti-gender movement. We also see abortion rights used a lot as that wedge issue. We see that in Poland right now. We've seen it historically across the United States. So that's, but again, even using the trans community as a wedge issue can still be used as context-specific ways. So in England, you see the TERFs and the anti-gender folks tend to use women-only spaces as their wedge space that they find most sort of the place where they start but never end. In the United States, we have seen really aggressive use of youth sports as the wedge to start going after the trans community in this very coordinated and politicized way. And my colleagues will have a lot more to say about it, but I think it's really important to know, especially for Americans, that the what we see with the legislation proposed, with the school board attacks, this is not happening organically. It's a playbook. And it's an anti-gender movement playbook around abortion and around trans rights. It's well funded, it's well coordinated. Our colleagues at GPP have a really excellent report called Manufacturing Moral Panic, specifically about how broadly across the world groups and governments use this manufactured moral panic about young people and youth rights as a way to get a foothold on defining rights in a way that defines and excludes us and many of us and the rights that allow us to thrive and live our lives the way we want to. I would just note, sort of on this big picture level, that there really are international human rights goals or lack of human rights goals that go with the anti-gender movement. So while we may see it showing up as attacking drag brunch or libraries in the United States, they're big UN level goals around defining human rights in a way that excludes especially abortion rights and trans rights, but probably LGBT rights more broadly, defines the family in a very specific and conservative way. We saw this happen during the Trump administration. The Trump administration was a very powerful anti-gender actor and had two particular international ways of doing that. One was the Commission on Unalienable Rights, which was a commission pulled together by the Trump White House and the Secretary of State to define unalienable rights separate from human rights, and specifically set aside LGBTQI rights and abortion rights as not part of the Unalienable Rights Commission, but rather contentious social issues. So even in how they defined the commission, they excluded LGBTQI rights and abortion rights, all reproductive rights, as not a rights discussion, but rather contentious social issues. That commission put out a report. They continue, even as they're out of office, to try to normalize the findings of the Unalienable Rights Commission as a separate a separate norm outside of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all of the binding agreements that have come from that. Similarly, the Trump administration drafted, promoted, and strong-armed other countries into supporting the Geneva Consensus Declaration, which is a declaration not from Geneva and not consensus-based, around women's health that explicitly, again, excludes abortion and defines the family in a way that excludes non-binary people, LGBTQI people, just sort of writ large. It's a very narrow sort of Vatican vision of family that folks familiar with UN fights are very familiar with it, but it's enshrined into the Geneva Consensus Declaration. And again, that is a very high politics attempt by the anti-gender movement, the government actors of the anti-gender movement, to create an alternative vision of rights that excludes, at the very least, the sort of LGBT rights, not even talking about marriage equality, but the rights to our own body, the rights to self-definition, and the rights to pick when, if, how we marry, get pregnant, start families, what the families look like. All of those rights are ones that the anti-gender movement is attempting to exclude from international law and international norms. And they had a lot of success during the Trump administration. So that's our broad level, happening both at an international level, but also happening in libraries, in movements, in how police forces respond to our movements. And to say, I won't go deep into the money, but many colleagues have in reports, is very well funded. So again, it's coordinated, but it's not centralized. The playbook being used in Oklahoma is the same playbook being used in Hungary. And the trans community feels it most immediately, and in some very, very harmful ways. But the intent of the anti-gender movement is never to end with the trans movement, and is oftentimes linked very much to their broader view of inhibiting social progress and the progress of rights. I'll end there, Ricky.
Oh, I'm muted. Great. Thank you so much. It is such a major worry to hear your presentation and to think of how far-reaching their tactics are when they affect the lives of individuals, young trans kids that are facing problems in schools, but joining sports teams. Or if you think of what's going on in the state of Virginia, which is not far from where I live, currently, around the discussion around the bathrooms for trans children. And speaking of the funding, some research I did, I was reading on it this weekend, said, and these figures go back to, I think, 2017, 2018, by then, the anti-gender movement was 3 times more funded than the basic human rights movements like LGBTI and those movements. Speaking to the trans and the impact of do you want to respond, Pam?
I was actually going to say it's even worse than that.
Really?
The 3 times is the money we can count.
Right.
But in the United States, religious organizations and churches don't have to report their expenditures on this kind of thing. And so it's 3 times what we know, but then all of the US evangelical groups and religious groups that are pouring money into anti-trans activities and anti-abortion activities in Kenya and Uganda and Zambia and South Africa, none of that money has to get reported.
Oh, that is so correct. And you know, and speaking of the countries you mentioned now, if you look at the trend that's happening in those countries, in Uganda, in Ghana, in Kenya, around the anti-LGBT movement that is so strong and is so well funded, and really the pushback is really coming from the church. It connects all the dots, right, of how strong this movement is and how far-reaching the implications are of the work that they do. And I think I'll hand it over to Erica now to speak more in depth about what's happening vis-a-vis the trans movement. I know Kate has done some amazing work and they have some great detail around the implications of the anti-gender movement in as far as it affects the global trans community. Erica?
Thank you very much, Ricky. And please let me know if I should turn off my video because I seem to be having some connectivity issues.
Well, so far you're good. I will let you know.
Please let me know. I just want to say, picking up from what Bern shared, really emphasizing of how well resourced the anti-gender movement is and how it has, because it's so well resourced, both financially and with human resources, it is able to penetrate different arenas. So political arena, media, all levels, and UN spaces, national spaces, regional spaces. It's really an all-front attack and very coordinated. And also another characteristic, it's its huge adaptability. Bern already mentioned how it looks very different in different countries, and it's because of that huge amount of resources, it can adapt pretty easy and with with less effort because of the resources it has. So one of the things I want to highlight is, what forms of attacks we're seeing. We've been able to document, and we've also been able to work with partners around the world. And we're seeing these attacks at different levels. At policy level, we are noticing the inclusion or bringing forward new laws that are very damaging to the trans community, but also and more damaging, and something that is really alarming, the revoking of existing laws that are going backwards in places and in situations that 2 or 3 years ago would have been totally unexpected. And that is something that we should worry a lot, because all this movement is centered into an anti-right, anti-democracies movement that is against everything that has to do, particularly around sexual and reproductive health, around trans issues, and in recognition not only of our identities, but of our mere existence. We're seeing a lot of these attacks being fueled by fear being instigated in the public, in families, about children, and it's really done in many spaces, particularly the use of the media and their well coordinated and good use of the media, which results in a lot of broadcasts in this issue. But we're also seeing very coordinated attacks towards organizations, limiting the space for the organization, blocking registering trans organizations, for example, in several countries, making it hugely difficult to have NGOs of trans community, but also blocking the resources that these organizations need. And again, we are left with movements that depend 100% in many cases in voluntarism without being able to have the adequate resources to respond. This also leads to personal attacks. Um, the attacks are also to individuals, and we're seeing it in countries like Zambia, where the leaders of the trans communities, their photos and names were posted on social media, calling literally to kill them. That is really radical, and it's very worrying for our communities, and it's being fueled, by all the fear, misunderstanding, and all this putting um trying to put rights one against the other when that never should be the case. Uh, so one of the things that I think in response the community, is starting to organize better at, and being able to do it not only at a global level to find information and data, which is extremely important and needed. But how can we equip the communities on the ground, the organizations and the activists in the countries, in regions, to be able to be equipped to respond better? So one of the things that is happening is more documentation, funding sources. This is happening at global levels, regional, national level, to really follow, we always hear the expression follow the money, to really, really identify where is the funding coming from. We can be sometimes receive some nasty surprises when following the money. We're seeing that what works is working in partnerships. We need to be able to really um, hold each other up in this coordinated attack, and be able to really depend on each other in each other's strengths. For a long time, and I've always said this, our movements have been characterized by competition, or who gets more, and putting the LGBTIQ about who gets more mention, who gets more visibility, who gets more money. I really call on our communities to leave those differences aside and really stand up for each other on this issue. Because while there might be the perception that this um, affects directly trans community, but it's not only the trans community being affected, it's all of us. So we should keep that in mind. And then one of the things that is really crucial is that we need to be able to respond in a more coordinated, proactive way. So if we continue to be reactive, it's gonna be always chasing after them, because they have so much adaptability and so much resources. We need to be able to do some proactive response and prevention and harm reduction based on a human rights framework. So looking forward, I think what I can say is that it's really a time to work together, to really join forces and really strengthen each other, to share resources, something that unfortunately I'm very critical of this, we're not very good at. And cultivating allies. I think among many organizations, there's so much wonderful resources that have been produced, and we need to give them the spotlight and be able to share them community in a community. I'm gonna leave it there for now, Ricky.
Yeah, thank you so much, Erika. That really is, it's, being involved in the movement at a global level. We have these discussions all the time as to how best can we respond, or what can we do as the global trans community to try and maybe see what best we can do. People have put in the chat here, somebody in the UK said that they've tried that in the UK, but it didn't work. And Kim has said in Canada, the anti-gender movement is specifically targeting school board elections and running candidates almost as if they are their own political party. In Latin America, there's an alliance between the church and the evangelicals, and they've gained access to public office, and from there they advance policies and go against women's and LGBTIQ rights. And it seems to go on and on and on. And predominantly in the global north, and I'm speaking here of the UK and the United States, and also speaking in Western Europe. It's also spilling over into Eastern Europe, to Poland, and to those countries as well. In America, as I've said, just last year there was a rollback of over 133 trans bills. That there were bills passed in the House to reverse trans rights in the United States across more than 130 states in the United States. So it really is worrying. But I'll hand over to Jabu now, who hopefully will sort of rally the troops together and let's speak to resilience in the movement. And we hopefully will not only speaking trans here, we're speaking generally LGBTIQ movements, and then we can sort of wrap up after that and see. We can summarize and take questions from the floor.
Oh, excellent. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think in preparing for this talk, I thought, of course, the escalation of this kind of attacks have of course increased resourcefully, structurally, systemically, and of course also how these states have also permeated their own civic ways of kind of getting involved, like from school governing bodies to churches to all sorts of associations, people having cake sales, whatever, right? So like everybody is kind of involved in different ways on the attacks. And so I had to think about this in preparing this this talk. And so these are my offerings, just purely, strictly as an activist. And I hope we can engage on this. And I was saying, and my starting point is just to say that it seems really evident that states, from the very onset of the creation of state systems, thinking back 3 centuries, 4 centuries, the very training of those systems have always been about the kind of structure and power of the creation of the hateful gaze, and how the hateful gaze becomes embodied in the training of police and military systems. And when I think about the hateful gaze, it's also in the very notion and creation of homogeneous nation states, and how nation states have from its very onset of creation have had this embodiment of the hateful gaze. And we can think about this in multiple ways. The colonial projects across Africa, across Latin America, I mean, everywhere where there's been occupation of the most vulnerable, the Philippines, deep senses of these kind of hateful gaze, ways of systematizing oppression and systematizing oppression for the mere purpose of embarking and increasing the notions of capitalism. And that capitalism in itself becomes the embodiment of why this hateful gaze has to reside and why it has to exist. And of course, this gaze, as I've said, has been directed largely at minorities, at societies and groups who choose to step outside of nation state, who chooses to step outside of heteronormativity and difference. And in its own way, these groups attempt in many ways to destabilize the accumulation of power as well as the accumulation of wealth. So we have to think about this in the framing of our activism in this particular century. I think the other issue is that, and looking at it is to say that it's not uncommon that high on this list of the hateful gaze are Black persons, and high on the list of this hateful gaze are earlier times of enslavement of Black bodies, looking at the oppression of trans bodies, gay bodies, lesbian bodies, intersex bodies. This hateful gaze permeates in all ways. And I think looking at what Professor Juana Maria Rodriguez states is that it's the ultimate control on how we look, who we fuck, and what we refuse to accept. And as normative strengths, these normative ways of kind of strengthening systemic power to really repress the protagonists that refuse to be normative and that refuse to be embodied in enslavement, in poor labor, and who refuse completely to be silent. And when I looked at this, I looked at the oldest record of resistance, and I came across some writing from Channing Joseph, and he found evidence of a likely, the first recorded queer resistance by a slave. He's, or I would claim and say that their name was William Dorsey Swan, because text always wants to enforce a binary in particular languages. And so they were born in Maryland in 1860. And in 1880, I found that they were convicted for keeping what was called a disorderly house, which was a house for sex work, drag balls, and I would say possibly a trans-affirming space of resistance. And in 1888, we saw the first resistance of at least written evidence of 13 Black drag queens, trans persons that were arrested and framed in writing as freaks. And so when we look at this and we say 3 centuries later, we are still in this resistance. But I have to ask this, and to all of us, are we really in this resistance? And how is this resistance now framing itself and showing it up? And are we really, in a way, are we organized, or are we merely in a resourceful way of kind of movement building in a flow that has forgotten the greatest impact of these anti-gender movements, which really rest on their intentional aggression to erase Black queer bodies, to erase sex workers, and so in so many ways to this moral high ground, and to clean up our streets, etc., to bring back some normalcy in many ways, and to continue prohibiting women and trans men from having their right to abortion, to erase migrants, and ultimately to uphold a white supremacist capitalist model strictly for the continuance of ensuring that many do earn or cannot earn a living wage, and those who are controlled and control who we are, who we fuck, and where we live, and how we move in society. And we have to look at this because, in a way, I think about how in this last few years we have celebrated Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, but we can't celebrate these people without recognizing the inherent struggles as sex workers. And if we look at the celebratory narratives, they only center them as trans bodies, as Black trans bodies, and the narrative has been abandoned about the erasure of sex work, the erasure of poverty, and the intersections of that struggle towards socioeconomic justice and wellness, because we can't talk about freedoms without talking about these issues. I think when we look at the fear-mongering way, for example, in this last few years, we've been dealing with COVID, and suddenly we were also dealing with monkeypox. It's just the added layers that I would add to what happens within how the anti-gender movement continues to kind of spur on this notion of diseased bodies. We are spreaders of things, and therefore we are ultimately not deserving of any freedoms. And so that interconnectedness I found quite interesting about COVID and suddenly the monkeypox. And what does this mean in terms of an increased health system meant to protect us, but also in a way exacerbating stigma in many ways. But on the other hand, I think there's many resilient things that are happening. Most recently in July, I came across the Kenya government passed the Children's Act, which really, I've never seen law in Africa that centers the protection of intersex-born children in the way that the Kenya legislation does, that it recognizes that in our society, there are women and men and intersex persons. I think this is incredibly welcoming. This past week, South Africa has announced that it is decriminalizing sex work as another centering part. But our struggles of resistance really needs a lot of deep introspection, because knowing about the anti-gender movement is not sufficient. We have to introspect about our resistance. And we have to think about this kind of introspection in whether we are privileging agendas that don't really center what I mentioned around the eradication of poverty, the socioeconomic empowerment of queer bodies in so many ways. And our silences, for example, on so many things, our silences on the medical abuse that intersex athletes, sports people had faced in these past years, Caster Semenya, Barbara Banda, Duty Chand, Annette Negesa. Our silences on the LGBTI refugees in the Kakuma camp who have suffered incredible abuse, isolation, and violence, that they've been abandoned by the UN and our movements, and that queer liberation is fought in our bodies. So we have to think about this. We have to think about where is our resistance sitting and how is it locating itself. Our silences speak to the way in which we've become accustomed to abandoning the most vulnerable, I would argue. And for the new embeddedness of our state capture, we have been captured. Our movements have been captured by states and by bodies that in a way that as human rights defenders, where do we sit in our resistance at this stage? I think I would say, let us not assume that we have the right or correct people inside our governments. We don't. It still remains a state that is there for a particular moment in time. And our delight and our excitement is very short-lived, with short-lived expectations and huge disappointing expectations. Let's see what happens after Biden in 5 years. We live for this moment, but how short-lived these moments are. I think if we opt to conduct queer liberation in a manner that continues to deepen and construct class and race in the manner that it does, we are merely deepening fractures and allowing the anti-gender movement to completely annihilate our movement and to erase any form of resistance that we've tried to build up. I would argue that all this money that we are putting into our movements, we must open our bars, we must build our dungeons, we must allocate money towards queer lives who want to own land. We must center wellness in the way that we think about resource allocation. We cannot only be centering our resources and say we need to just be in the UN and build on advocacy. We need to constructively think about socioeconomic wellness. We need to get off our online liking post apps. We need to be in the street and we need to build. We need to engage. And I'm quite inspired by Ruthie Gilmore, an abolitionist scholar, asks if we are heading to a triage. And I think we know what a triage is when you are in a hospital, and whether you're going to live or whether you're going to die. And the preliminary assessment, in my view, is to assess whether we're eradicating poverty, whether we're eradicating so many issues in this particular way, and how we able to assess our political and economic existence in the face of possible erasure of all of that. And lastly, I will end and I will say that we need to take our raw rage and we have to create our freedoms in placing our bodies in so many ways and in our collective struggles. Our bodily integrity rests on how we build the most vulnerable, and our true test is whether we've built an inclusive structural form of power for our movements to reside here for a long time. And as Ruthie Gilmore states, the impossible is realized by creative aggression. And the greatest joy of freedom is a place in which we feel that solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you, Jabal. Very powerful. Said like a blazing leading activist. Thank you very much. And I heard a lot of things that you spoke about, Jabal. You spoke about us coming together, right? But then we cannot really do too much without the investment that's needed. So we need the funding. We need the funding to be able to fight these systems, to empower the LGBTI movements that are being crushed by the anti-gender movement, that will empower the trans community to respond to a bigger global picture. And without the funding, we really cannot get there. I also heard that we need to get involved in political spaces. So where are our young upcoming politicians in the LGBTI community? Where are they, and what are they doing? What are we doing to enable an environment for them to be able to engage with other politicians and to take our mission to the wider public? I also heard about greater policy involvement and policy engagement. What are we doing to speak to the policies that are being written about us and for us, to actually suppress us and to dominate us? All those things need to be addressed. And then again, there's also the intersectional lens. How do we work with other movements to counter this global monster that's attacking all of us? How does the trans movement speak to basically generally the rest of the LGBT movements? And are we one homogenous society, or are we still working in our silos, and do we have differences and split, and are we fighting for the small piece of pie that is funding? So it's a wide-ranging, multifaceted, multi-pronged approach that we need to take to even begin to address the anti-gender movement, which, as Bian said, is more than 3 times the funding that we have as the LGBTI. It's, I think, maybe 10, maybe 100, 1,000 times more than 3 times. It really is. It's a major worry and something we need to discuss. So I'd like to open up to the other panelists just to see, we have a few more minutes for us to continue discussion. But just to pick up on what Jabo said, Erica, how do you think we could respond as a global trans movement with regards to the points that were brought up?
So I think we're already starting to do that. You know, we are there. Perhaps we are very far from where we should be and where we could be as a community, but we have definitely started. And you know, a big portion of what we have already started is producing the evidence that is needed and being able to support our communities and having working towards having healthy organizations that have the capacity to respond. And we don't only need funding, it goes beyond funding. Funding is a huge need and a huge component of what we need, but it goes way beyond that. It needs also, it means also being much more aware and much more directive around issues of inclusion, of social justice, of issues about how we lead as a community also. You know, many times looking at the fact that a lot of what is being led is from global north organizations, and we need to recognize that is an issue in itself, and how we need to be able to recognize not only our privilege from the position we're doing the work, but allowing those that are not in our in the same position to take the leadership space that is necessary. So I think that is something we need to do much more of, is fomenting and creating the spaces for leadership. And it's related to enabling an environment where our communities can engage in political and social movements that bring about change. Um, we're still far away, and we've seen some courageous trans LGBT people who have embarked in the political arena, and in some cases with very good results. And it's extremely challenging. So I think we need to support more of that and do it in a very organized manner, looking at the benefits of being involved in political movements. And lastly, I want to share just about, you mentioned, Ricky, about the wider LGBTI society and the question about how we're working. I think we continue, unfortunately, to work in silos. And that shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. But it's not only that we work in silos, is that sometimes we overstep the work of the other without acknowledging and without bringing up our partners. And, we're talking about, when we talk about trans and intersex communities, these are the most underserved populations, the most underfunded, and the most communities that their resources, including financial and human, are taken away by other groups.
Okay, Erica, very, very strong points. We have some questions in the question and answer boxes. And the first one is, what is the definition of anti-gender? Is there one that is universally accepted, or does it vary based on country? And Björn, as the expert, I will put you on the spot.
I mean, the short answer is there is not one agreed upon, because we are defining ourselves in opposition to people who are in opposition to us. So it is itself a somewhat challenging frame, because they have defined the gender ideology as one that is this amorphous threat to family values, traditional values, and then we have had to go on the defensive in both sort of legislative spaces and social and physical spaces. I mean, to Jabu's point, it's very reactionary and not. It's not a creation of ourselves, and it's not a creation from a place of hope or self-definition. I would say broadly, we oftentimes define it as, like I said, it's a group of state and non-state actors who are really intent on imposing this conservative set of norms and laws that really define rights in a way that excludes LGBTQI rights, abortion rights, reproductive rights, and many of the rights to bodily autonomy and relational autonomy that have been huge successes for many movements around the world in the last 50 years. So it's not a pretty sexy definition, and it's intentionally hard for us to define the anti-gender movement.
Thank you, Ben. We have a couple more questions and we're running out of time. The next question is, how would the panel suggest older adults in the group become active? Some cannot take to the streets, some are afraid to do so. How do we respond to the attack?
I think there are multiple ways. I mean, I think it's about connecting with community. It's about, online connection, being there with your community in terms of, I mean, of course, safety first, but I think there's so many multitudes of ways. Write an anonymous letter to your newspaper, just trying to be present in ways, and sometimes just being support is enough. We all have different roles in this big job of fighting oppression. I would say find your comfort space and yeah, join in that way.
Yeah, great, thank you, Jabu. And then we have another question that's asking, speaking about the competition among the movements, what are some concrete strategies to prevent or interrupt such competition in the regime of scarcity of resources that we all operate in.
So I will share briefly on that one. I think one of the main causes that we need to address is how fast some of our organizations lose our identities because we respond to colonial practices of funding from donors. We let donors set the agenda for us and our communities instead of us driving the need to respond to them. And as long as we do that, we're going to be fighting over cents and not really addressing the real need of our communities. So I think better communication is needed. And actually, we talk a lot about removing boundaries and barriers and borders from countries. We need to remove those same barriers amongst ourselves in order to work together.
And decolonization is across the board, including funding as well. And the last question we have is to Björn. What connections do you see existing between the higher levels of the anti-gender movement and more localized calls towards systematic violence, as is being seen currently in the US towards drag events?
Super easy question to finish with. So I will say, I mean, this is a really broad strokes, but we could have 5 more panels talking about both the tactics and actors of the anti-gender movement. So we could do a whole panel on their incredible use of misinformation and new technologies. They are frankly much more skilled at alternative types of fundraising. So YouTube fundraising, Instagram fundraising, TikTok fundraising than we are. We don't think of that, but they are. And we could do an entire day on the way that they create terroristic threats through building of public discourse. It is like 8 different people's dissertations and hard for us to distill here from the big picture, capital P politics, into the lived experience of trans kids trying to safely go to school. But the links are there. This is the place where, I don't think it's fair to put the obligation for transformation on the transgender movement. I think much of the obligation for transformation is on funders and is on the other movements that are oftentimes exclusionary of the trans voices that should be leaders there. So I think a lot of it in the United States is a lot of the feminist movement, especially the traditional abortion movement, the Washington, D.C. abortion movements, have been very bad about being trans exclusionary in sort of in how they're baked. And so those groups listening to the local activists and following their lead on what will lead to safety, what will lead to longer term change, I think is a really necessary step. There's some really good stuff happening with looking at how funders and organizations like Citizen Go are pouring money into misinformation campaigns on places like Instagram and TikTok to skew young people's knowledge of these issues. So I think it's a really long, big question, but to answer to end in a place of sort of hope, I do actually think that one of the places that people have been very successful is when we see an attack, whether it's local or whether it's at a state level or whether it's at a national level, going out hard and broad and firm that we will not allow it. We will not allow them to set the narrative at X, and getting as many groups across the board, as many leaders, as many academics, standing firm at the very beginning can cut off a whole way of them trying to do business and trying to go after attacks. So the more immediate powerful across the board solidarity visibly that we can accomplish, the more that we can help direct the narrative.
Thank you, Bea. What a strong and positive note in which to end this webinar. I'd like to thank you so much. Thank you, Bea, thank you, Erica, thank you, Jabu, for your insight, your excellence, your passion, your strength. And just to everybody out there, our democracy and our rights are being attacked in front of our faces really, really strongly, and we need to make a call and let's see what we can do to beat this monster. On a closing note, I'd like to congratulate Erica Castellanos, I read online today, who has been appointed as the Executive Director of GATE. Previous to this, we had her as Interim Director on our comms communications. Congratulations, Erica. And thank you once again for tuning in, and enjoy the rest of our Summit 2022.